that this became obvious to Foucault, even if it is still refused as a critic by many of his followers, is apparent for it is apparent from the further and distinctive shift in his work marked by the later and incomplete volumes of his so-called History of Sexuality, The Use of Pleasure, 1987, The Care of the Self, 90, 1988, and as far as we can gather, the unpublished, from the point of view of the critic, just passed the critical volume on the perversions. For here, without moving very far from his insightful work on the productive character of normative regulation, not subjects outside the law, as Judith Butler puts it, he tacitly recognizes that it is not enough for the law to summon discipline, produce, and regulate, but there must also be the corresponding production of a response, and thus the capacity and the apparatus of subjectivity from the side of the subject in the critical introduction of the use of the pleasure. Foucault lists what by now we would expect of this work: the correlation between fields of knowledge, types of normality, and forms of subjectivity in particular cultures, but now critically adds the practices by which individuals were led to focus attention on themselves, to decipher, recognize, and acknowledge themselves as subjects of desire, bringing into play between themselves and themselves a certain relationship that allows them to discover in desire the truth of their being, be it natural or fallen. In short, with this genealogy, the idea was not investigate how individuals were led to practice on themselves and on others hermeneutics of desire, 1987. Foucault describes this correctly, in our view, as a third shift in order to analyze what is termed the subject. It seems appropriate to look for the forms and moralities of the relation to self by which the individual constitutes and recognizes himself qua subject. Foucault, of course, will not commit anything so vulgar as actually to deploy the term identity, but I think with the relation to self and the constitution and recognition of himself qua subject, we are approaching something of the territory which, in terms established earlier, belongs to the problematic of identity. This is not a place to trace through the many productive insights which flow from Foucault's analysis of the true games and the elaboration of ethical work, of the regimes of self-regulation and self-fashioning, of the technologies of the self involved in the constitution of the desiring subject. There is certainly no single switch to agency, to intention and volition here, though they are very centrally the practices of freedom which prevent this subject from ever being simply a docile sexualized body. But there is the production of self as an object in the world. The practices of self-constitution, recognition and reflection, the relation of the rule alongside the scrupulous attention to normative regulation and the constraints of the rules without which no subjectification is produced. This is a significant advance since it addresses for the first time in Foucault's major work the existence of some interior landscape of the subject, some interior mechanisms of ascent of the rule, as well as its objectively disciplining force, which saves the account for the behaviorism and objectivism which threatens certain parts of discipline and punish. Often in this work, the ethics and practices of the self are most fully described by Foucault as an aesthetics of existence, a deliberate stylization of daily life, and its technologies are most effectively demonstrated in the practices of self-production in a specific modes of conduct, in what we have come from later work to recognize as a kind of performativity. What I think we can see here then is Foucault being pushed by the scrupulous rigors of his own thinking through a series of conceptual shifts and different stages in his work towards a recognition that since the centering of the subject is not the destruction of the subject, and since the centering of discursive practice cannot work without the constitution of subjects, the theoretical work cannot be fully accomplished without complementing the account of discursive and disciplinary regulation with an account of these practices of subjectivity, self-constitution. It has never been enough in Marx, in Althusser, in Foucault, to elaborate a theory of how individuals are summoned into place in the discursive structures. It has always also required an account of how subjects are constituted, and in his work Foucault has gone a considerable way in showing this in reference to historically specific discursive practices, normative, self-regulation and technologies of the self. The question which remains is whether we also require to, as it were, close the gap between the two. That is to say, a theory of what the mechanisms are by which individuals as subjects identify or do not identify with the positions to which they are summoned, as well as how fashion, stylize, produce and perform these positions, and why they never do so completely for once and all time, and some never do or are in constant agonistic process of struggling with, resisting, negotiating, and accommodating the normative or regulative rules with which they confront and regulate themselves. In short, what remains in the requirement to think this relation of subject to discursive formations as an articulation. All articulations are properly relations of non-necessary correspondence, e.f. founded on that contingency which reactivates the historical. Laclau, 1990. It is therefore all the more fascinating that when finally Foucault does make the move in this direction, in work which was then tragically cut short, he was prevented, of course, from going to one of the principal sources of thinking about these neglected aspects, namely psychoanalysis, prevented from moving in that direction by his own critique of it as simply another network of disciplinary power relations. What he produces instead is a discursive phenomenology of the subject, drawing perhaps on earlier sources and influences whose importance for him have been somewhat underplayed, and a genealogy of the technologies of the self. But it is a phenomenology which it is danger of being overwhelmed by by an overemphasis of intentionality, precisely because it cannot engage with the unconscious for good or will. That door was already foreclosed. Fortunately, it has not remained so. In Gender Trouble 1990, and more specifically in Bodies That Matter 1993, Judith Butler has taken up, through her concern with the discursive limits of sex and with the politics of feminism, the complex transactions between the subject, the body, and identity, through the drawing together in one analytic framework insights drawn from Foucauldian and psychoanalytic perspective, adopting the position that the subject is discursively constructed and that there is no subject before or outside the law. Butler develops a rigorously argued case that sex is from the start normative. It is what Foucault has called a regulatory ideal. In this sense, then sex not only functions as a norm but is part of a regulatory practice that produces, through the reception of or iteration of a norm which is without origin, the bodies it governs, that is, whose regulatory force is made clear as a kind of productive power, the power to produce, demarcate, circulate, differentiate, the bodies it controls. Sex is an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through time. Butler 1993. Materialization here is retold as an effect of power. The review that the subject is produced in the course of its materialization is strongly grounded in a performative theory of language and the subject, but performativity is shown on its associations with volition, choice, and intentionality. And against some of the misreadings of Gender Trouble, reread not as the act by which a subject not as the act by which a subject brings into being that he names, but rather as that reiterative power of discourse to produce the phenomena that it regulates and constrains. Butler 1993. The decisive shift from the viewpoint of the argument being developed here, however, is a linking of this process of assuming a sex with the question of identification and with the discursive means by which the heterosexual imperative enables certain sexes identification and forecloses and or disavows other identifications. Butler 1993. This centering of the question of identification together with the problematic of the subject which assumes a sex opens up a critical and reflexive dialogue in Butler's work between Foucault and psychoanalysis, which is enormously productive. It is true that Butler does not provide an elaborate theoretical meta argument for the way the two perspectives or the relation between the discursive and the psychic are thought together in are thought together in her text beyond a suggestive indication. There, there may be a way to subject psychoanalysis to a Foucauldian redescription, even as Foucault himself refused that possibility. At any rate, this text accepts as a point of departure of Foucault's notion that regulatory power produces the subjects in controls, that power is not only imposed externally, but works as the regulatory and normative means by which subjects are formed. The return to psychoanalysis then is guided by the question of how certain regulatory norms form a sexed subject in terms that establish the indis- indistinguish, indis- indistinguishability of psychic and bodily formation. 1993. However, Butler's relevance of the argument is made all the more pertinent because it is developed in the context of the discussion of gender and sexuality framed by feminism, and so is directly recurrent both to the questions of identity and identity politics, and to the questions which after Bragg works posed earlier about the paradigmatic function of sexual difference in relation to other axes of exclusion. Through the discursive construction of a constitutive outside and the production of abjected and marginalized subjects, apparently outside the field of the symbolic, the representable, the production of an outside a domain of intelligent effects, 1993, which then returns to trouble and unsettle the foreclosures which we prematurely call identities. She deploys this argument with effect in relation to the sexualizing and the radicalizing of the subject, an argument which requires to be developed if the constitution of subjects in and through the normalizing regulatory effects of racial discourse is to acquire the theoretical development hitherto reserved to gender and sexuality. Though, of course, her most well-worked example in the relation to the production of these forms of sexual abjection and lived unintelligibility are usually normalized as pathological or perverse. As James Sauter, 1995, has pointed out, Butler's internal critique of feminist identity politics and its foundationalist premises questions the adequacy of a representational politics whose basis is the presumed universality and unity of its subject, a seamless category of woman, paradoxically, as in all other identities treated politically in a foundational manner. This identity is based on excluding different women, and by normatively prioritizing, prior, prioritizing heterosexual relations as the basis for feminist politics. This unity, Schauder argues, is a fictive unity, produces and is restrained by the very structure of power through which emancipation is thought. Significantly, however, as Schauder also argues, this does not lead Butler to argue that all notions of identity should therefore be abandoned because they are theoretically flawed. Indeed, she takes the speculary structures of identification as a critical part of her argument, but she acknowledged that such an argument does suggest the necessary limits of identity politics.